Hi, this is Jim Peters with Peters Principals. As you know, you never know who you're going to get on Peters Principals, and today we have Mr. Paul Georges, the president of the UTL, United Teachers of Lowell, and it's good to have him.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for being here.
And I do want to remind everybody that this is an opinion show. It's not a news show, it's an opinion show. It reflects my opinion for starters, and hopefully the person who I'm interviewing too. And it's not necessarily the opinion of the Lowell Telecommunications Corporation. So that being said, we can start. Okay.
Disclaimer already made.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to start with charter schools. I'm personally opposed to them, partially because the teachers don't have to be certified.
That's correct.
And they can be just people off the street who have a college degree. Is that?
Yeah, they don't have to be certified teachers. In traditional public schools need to be certified teachers, and charter schools do not.
Okay.
And they have to be licensed but not certified. So it's a different standard for charter schools. And yes, there is a number of other differences with charter schools that make them problematic, as opposed to traditional public schools.
Mm-hmm. Like what other problems?
Well, accountability is one of the major issues. Take City of Lowell, which most people that will be watching this program are familiar with. You have a school committee, a superintendent of schools, central administration. When investments are made, when money is spent, taxpayer dollars is being used, there is accountability to the local community through the school committee. School committee, the superintendent makes recommendations. School committee acts on the recommendations. If the public doesn't like the decision made by the school committee and recommended by the superintendent, then there's recourse. They can either decide to vote for a person or against it next time around. In the case of charter schools, they're run by a separate board of directors. It doesn't necessarily have to reflect, it doesn't even really need to come from the community. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to really include parents. It's wide open, and very often there's no accountability at all to the public, the people that are actually paying the bill, mm-hmm. because the funding of the charter school comes from public expenditures. So that's a real problem, because the accountability piece means that people can do what they want within a charter school, within some very broad limits. And I would say that DESE does not necessarily, the Department of Education does not necessarily watch these things with an acute eye. Right. And it consequently means that people's tax dollars go out of their control. As a matter of fact, the National Labor Relations Board recently called charter schools, or said charter schools are not public schools, in their opinion, because there's no public accountability to the public, to representatives of the people who are elected by the people to run the schools.
The accountability is from the master, the principal. Is that right?
Well, you're talking about the actual running of an individual school. I'm talking about the financial expenditures having to do with the school. Yeah, the principal in the school obviously runs their ship. I mean, there's, Ed Reform had a lot to say about that. But the actual amount of money, the money being spent, the tax revenues being spent by an individual school, or school district, obviously lies on the decision making of the school committee, which is obviously an elected body, elected by the public.
And the elected body elected by the public can be voted out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And not only that, I mean, you can go to any school committee meeting, and as long as there's something on the agenda, you can raise the issue and chip in, give your opinion. Mm. Many cases, the board of directors for charter schools have no accountability whatsoever. I mean, there was recently at one of the charter schools in Lowell, there was a change in leadership at the top. Apparently, whoever the director, right, I guess, was considered by a lot of the public to be particularly talented and had done a good job. And that person was let go. And apparently, there's why. Right. There's really no answer to that, because people don't know. However, the money itself that that funds that school is paid by taxpayers in the city of Lowell and across the state with state money that comes in as Chapter 70 money.
Okay. I have a number of problems with charter schools. I joked on another show about the idea that if this passes, I can set up the Jim Peters School of History and English, and have a reasonable expectation that it will be funded. So,
well, you probably might find that you wouldn't. Only for one reason, and nothing against you, Jim.
Yeah.
It's just that what's happened is, what started with the concept of charter schools was they would be incubators of innovation. Mm-hmm. They would come up with ideas, and it would be parents and teachers and other folks who were dedicated to public education that would try to come up with creative alternatives, if you want, to offer options and as examples of sort of moving forward in public education. And many of those schools were created that way when the first legislation was passed back in the 90s. Dedicated folks said, well, let's try this, let's try that, and let's work around this. And so they applied for charters and were in many cases granted charters. Since then, though, there has been the growth of the corporate charter chains.
Right.
And meaning that Madison Avenue Wall Street has gotten involved in this and invested lots of money to take charters or expand charter schools because it adds to their bottom line. And very often a charter may be considered a non-profit, but we know how non-profits sometimes are designated. A non-profit can still be a profit-making entity simply by managing the school, by supplying the school with goods and services, remedial products, curriculum in some cases, and all kinds of other things. Mm-hmm. So while it may be tagged as non-profit, it truly is profit. And so consequently, it's backed by the corporate entities that sell the products that they can market to charter schools and make a profit and tap into that $500 billion a year market of K-12 education, public expenditure of K-12 monies across the country. Mm-hmm. So that's why in this particular issue coming up with question 2, the majority of the money on the yes side is coming from hedge fund operators in Wall Street. Right. It's not so much grassroots kind of a movement with them, whereas the resistance to this proposal is largely done by grassroots people, including union members from both MTA and AFT, who find that this is not going to be good for kids in any way, shape, or form, or public education.
Well, I'm kind of interested also in the fact that I have this sticker on in front of me, and it says, our public schools students are #1 in the nation. Why change? If we're #1 in the nation, what does changing to the charter school cap? What does changing the cap actually do for public education in Massachusetts? It seems like it would drag it down.
Well, one of the problems, Jim, is that I think there has been a narrative about failure, and we know this. I've been going back to 30 years ago, Nation at Risk and so on, some of these kinds of things were predicting dire consequences for education in this country. Certainly Massachusetts has always been at the top of the heap. In the NAPTAS National Assessment of Educational Progress, we're #1. If you carve out Massachusetts, obviously, with states in competition with states. But also, if you use the same test, if you use the TIMSS test and the NAEP and compare internationally, Massachusetts is always right at the very top of the list.
Right.
We're certainly the top in the Western world, meaning our students produced very, very well.
Right.
I was just reading an article the other day in Boston Magazine where it's something I didn't even realize after being in this so long, but of course my focus is Lowell but Boston, Mass, who very often is attributed as a failing district. Very often it's portrayed as it,
yes, it
because there is a narrative about failure. Is one of the best performing big city public school systems in the country. But you never hear that because the people who want to market alternatives, when they want to market alternatives, they have to diminish support for what exists now. So even though we're the number one performing state in the country, the narrative has been that we are underperforming. The focus of underperformance in Massachusetts is based upon subcategories, largely kids from economically disadvantaged districts.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the divide is. But that's not recognized because it would interfere, the truth might interfere with the narrative of failing public education, thus creating a market for an alternative a la charter schools that afford an opportunity for the investors of the world to take advantage of that $500 billion a year K-12 public expenditure of public education, dollars toward K-12 education.
Okay.
So it's pretty easy to understand, but it's blatantly unfair. We had those bumper stickers done up at AFT several years ago because we found that most people had heard the failure narrative and didn't recognize that Massachusetts students are the best performing in the country.
Right.
And in the world, for the most part.
And that's determined by testing. Is that right?
Yeah, testing, and they would say that the NAEP is probably everybody seems to agree that the NAEP, which is a sort of a random sampling of students from state to state to state, has some authentic. It's not the focus. You know what I mean? The testing existed before there was a common curriculum.
Testing, I love to dig up old information about the Lowell Public Schools, and testing it has existed since the 1860s.
Oh, sure, but the focus on it now with high stakes testing.
Right.
You know, Jim, as you know, as an educator, every educator tests kids off, tries to find indicators of what a kid knows and doesn't know. That guides their practice as they move forward, right, with children in the classroom. I used to do it. I gave a mini quiz every week, so I could get an idea about who knew what based upon what we taught the previous week.
Now you taught math, right?
No, I taught science for a while, ESL science.
Okay.
But my primarily was ELL. I was an ELL teacher, and then ESL, and then later English. Taught junior English, American Lit.
Oh, okay. I thought you taught math for some reason.
No. Although in the past I've been, taught a number of different things in different capacities. But that was my primary focus in later years at Lowell High School was junior English. And I would give the quiz once a week. So if tests if the objective is to inform a teacher about what a kid knows, that's fine.
Right.
Teachers have developed that on their own through their own skill level for years and years. There are some products you can buy that maybe help. The Common Core has unified the curriculum so it doesn't vary as much as it used to, but it also makes public education a target again for the kinds of testing and remedial products, because the Common Core, whether you appreciate it or not, or whether or not you believe in it or not, allows the corporate entities again to produce products and emphasize testing. So a lot of this testing stuff has come, high stakes testing, has come through the race to the top criteria. I rarely ever find teachers who would have on their own supported many of the ideas that came with the race to the top criteria back in 2008 and 2009.
I haven't found virtually any that.
I agree with you. But at the time it was an agenda at the national level to try to unify public education in a lot of ways. And it was a time, and I will just tell you, it was sort of blackmail to a certain degree, because at a time when coffers there was no money being generated within states because of the economic collapse and real estate collapse and so on. It was one of these, well, if you buy onto this competitive grant called Race to the Top,
right,
then you will get dollars to save your system. And then consequently, so in a lot of ways it was strong-armed somewhat successful effort on the part of the federal government to get its way. In a lot of ways that educators that I know, and I certainly felt that through the whole period, against the will of educators, even though very often it was said it was done in collaboration with educators, it really wasn't.
Well, I always had difficulty with the designation of a specific teacher somewhere as the teacher of the year, teacher of this, teacher of that, because I met some fantastic teachers in Lowell High School, for instance, and I was also at the Sullivan Middle School for a while, and I met some fantastic teachers doing everything they could for the kids.
Oh, sure.
And designating one of them as being outstanding in America or whatever by the people who made those designations was just, I thought, not fair.
Well, it depends on how that designation is done. I would say, for instance, we do something with the Rotary Club every year, the recognition of teachers, but it's the teachers themselves at the building that determine who's going to be the teacher that they want to be honored. They are.
Oh, well, that's different.
And so if that's the case, I think it's more authentic. And every time I've seen teachers get that award, for their particular school, they always say, I'm just one person, but I represent everybody that's in the school, every teacher in the school.
Well, that's true. They do say that.
So from that perspective, it's not competitive in the sense that an outside entity says, this one is superior to that one or whatever. I mean, that's part of the problem with the whole testing regime, which because the testing has added a whole new dimension. It was just, 5-6 years ago when this Common Core was being touted about, and different groups were against, and some groups were in favor, and so on and so forth. The governors came out, I think, generally in favor of it. But one of the problems with the Common Core, and at the time there was an article that I was reading in the Huffington Post, where at the time Common Core was being adopted, a group of investors from hedge fund investors and so on Wall Street got together in Manhattan and had a discussion about this with an educational expert, saying the creation of Common Core would now create a perfect market for the kind of products that they could sell to new underperforming schools based upon the testing that they would give kids in those schools. So it was creating a market for a product by virtually undermining support for traditional public education. Think about those things.
True.
So, well, just like anything else, the marketing strategy for a lot of folks down at Madison Avenue is based upon you being unhappy with the product you're using now.
Right.
So if they continue to tell you the product doesn't work, even if your experience says that it probably does, you'll start to believe it's not working.
Right.
And at that point, they can give you the new product that will work for you.
Right.
And that's the marketing ploy. It's not dissimilar for what they're doing with the charter school expansion, by taking the #1 state in the country, performing state in the country, and portraying the traditional public education in Massachusetts as being a failure, even though all the data indicates that we're the best performing state in the country.
Right.
But the point is, you hear the narrative again and again of failure, 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 to create a market for an alternative. Now, we understand there is a discrepancy between different groups,
Right.
as far as achievement.
Right.
We know that. And certainly we know that because we've worked in a district where, we were not the wealthiest suburban
Right.
district with all kinds of resources available to us.
Right.
And we also know that because of the nature of the children that we have a large number of ELL, second language learners,
Right.
SPED students and so on. Kids that need special services. That requires additional money. But the argument is that somehow, I will never agree that Lowell schools are failing, because very often what we achieve most with the students are not things that are being tested.
Oh, no, that's true.
So until there's a fair way of assessing actually how effective we are, test scores should not be considered the highest priority. Yet Those test scores very often determine the ranking of schools supposedly competing with each other across the Commonwealth.
Right.
You know as well as I do, back in the 1980s when we had large numbers of students coming in from Southeast Asia, the first need of those students was not higher, understanding math and so on.
Right.
It was a socialization process. It was a matter of being able to feel accustomed, feel comfortable initially, and understand the customs and what was required of being in a new country.
Right.
Many of these kids came from Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on, and had no understanding at all about what it was like to be an American. And we had these kids that didn't even know what it was like to live through a winter because they had never done it.
Right. I had an opportunity when I first came here to be a sophomore in Lowell High School. And as a sophomore in Lowell High School, I didn't have any friends because I just moved into town. And these two people who were Greek came up to me and in very halting English said, "Can you teach us English?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess." And they ended up, the girl, they're twins, and the girl ended up as the valedictorian of the first school graduation of the University of Lowell. And so ELL is something that you teach kids all the time just by socializing with them, and that's an important part of it too.
In a structured lessons, obviously, in school, because that was a priority. The
Right.
point is, very often, if you look at the way schools are ranked now, or the Department of Education sort of looks at the effectiveness of public schools, they don't take into consideration the degree of difficulty that often accompanies being in a gateway city.
Right.
And there seems to be a reluctance to come up with the funding that's necessary to make sure that people can do the job well, but teachers do. And the example would be, if anybody was around here in the mid-'80s, when you had the large numbers of Southeast Asian students coming in, essentially from the kindling fields in Cambodia, and with a short stopover in the Philippines, and then right here.
Right.
Schools were effective, extremely effective, but if you based it on a test score, they would not be successful.
Well, that's because they couldn't speak the language.
That's true, but Dusty doesn't seem to have that in consideration because they require every kid to be tested nowadays. The testing, the high-stakes testing overlaps into the absurd sometimes with these things, and all I'm simply saying is I am proud of the gifted and committed, talented teachers that I've taught with over the years here in Lowell, and the positive impact they've had for this community and the children of this community over that period of time.
Right.
So when I hear the scenario of failure, when I hear this rhetoric about public education isn't doing its job and we need to replace it with a for-profit for let's just say, to create an environment of opportunity for Wall Street investors at the expense of public education, it disturbs me greatly.
Yeah, it does me too. Okay, I wanted to switch a little bit to health paraprofessionals.
Sure.
Because I know that you do paraprofessionals.
Yeah, we've represented
We've represented
paraprofessionals
for years now, right?
Correct.
I had a quote from a paraprofessional. He said, I will have a special needs I help special needs children to get the skills of life so they can function in society. Things that are very normal for everybody, like going to the bathroom, kids don't know how to do necessarily if they're from another culture, or help them learn to feed themselves. And he broke it down into those very
basic fundamental
categories.
Yeah.
And he is a health paraprofessional, and he says, I am paid only $2,000 more a year than educational paras who are in regular ed rooms. He says that in his opinion, paras don't feel appreciated by the administration in the schools, and I would take it that he also means by the administration as well.
Well, I don't know, I think that varies from school to school. There's a lot of schools here, and I think there's probably, in some cases, some administrators at various schools are very open about the contribution the paraprofessionals make, and in other cases, they probably don't. Depends on their management style.
Okay.
Certainly, we appreciate it, and certainly central administration appreciates it, because they understood, and teachers certainly do. Teachers absolutely do. Because they understand, they're in the classroom with them, and they know exactly what they do and how they work.
Yeah, that was my impression too. Paras often, according to him, need to assume the role of teachers. Is that?
On occasion, if a teacher is out, there's a provision that a teacher could the para could substitute for a teacher. They
Right.
get a little bit of a premium in the day if they should take over. In some cases, if teachers are called out of the classroom because of some other event, which may be like, for instance, a team meeting on an individual IEP or something, the para will take over for a short period of time. It makes sense. The person that's in the classroom knows the kids and so on. Yeah, and they do that for short periods of time. If they do it for over a certain amount of time, then they're paid a premium. If they do it for less, it's less. We'd like to modify that, because in some cases we don't want it to be set up to be abusive.
Right.
Where the same para is in, the same, you know what I mean?
Right.
Kind of doing it. They should be paid for the additional responsibility they have, if it's a short period of time, but that's to be discussed at the bargaining table.
Yes. Okay. Well, he just was. It just was for me a really
Open your eyes.
eye-opening
Yeah.
Discussion, because legally, ethically, and morally, they are responsible for the students that they have, and that's quite a responsibility, I would assume.
Well, part of the problem, Jim, is that if, for instance, let's say a teacher is out, and you would say, well, geez, the para should run the classroom, okay, because the teacher's out, and then they should get a substitute to come in and work with the para under the para. The problem is if the para takes over the class, very often they just don't bring in the substitute. So they bring in a substitute teacher to work with the para, but the para actually runs the show because the para knows the day-to-day workings of the classroom.
Right.
There should be some kind of reversal of that, but we don't have a list of substitute paraprofessionals, so that's part of the issue.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay. That was basically the interview that I had with him. You seem to be on top of it, so.
Well, we've been working with the paras for a long time. I would say that when I first came in, I think they were abysmally paid. I don't think they make what they should be making, but they do. But they have improved considerably, and the demands on them though have increased. Have increased.
Have increased. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
It's
Well, thank you. Anytime.
okay. I appreciate it.
And remember, no one too.
Yeah. You don't have to say it to me, but I have to say it to a few people.
There you go.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.